thanks for joining us for another edition of Northwest Newsweek. I'm Mitchell Ringos. Well, the annual Noma Conference wrapped up on Friday, highlighted by the much-anticipated Bear Pit session. It gave municipal leaders the chance to ask pointed questions to 9 provincial cabinet ministers, with highway safety in the region at the forefront. Vasilios Bellos was at the Noma Conference and has the details.
Friday was the third and final day of the Noma Conference, and as it traditionally has, concluded with the popular Bear Pit session. It allowed municipal leaders from the Northwest to question a number of provincial ministers who attended on issues most important to the region. The session was highlighted by highway safety and trucker training, as the Northwest has seen numerous fatalities on area highways this winter. The discussion was sparked by Economy Councillor Grant Arnold, who questioned how the province was improving highway safety.
It's $592 million in the capital plan for 23-24 to make sure that we are appropriately investing into the widening and enhancements of highways and bridges and ramps where necessary.
The conversation was continued by Greenstone Councillor Eric Peach, who wanted to know about whether the government was considering incorporating a simulator into trucker training to get those from outside the region comfortable with the severe northwestern driving conditions.
That opportunity for students to get to try their skills in that safe environment where they're not going to also hurt anyone before they step into the real world. So I think there's a great opportunity to continue that conversation.
We'd like to take a look at how we talk and interact with training agencies and companies that give these folks experience.
There are also concerns about truckers going long stretches without being able to stop in the region, which could lead to fatigue and dangerous outcomes. Greenstone Mayor James McPherson used the Noma Conference as a chance to let the province know his municipality could be part of a solution.
There are no winter truck stops between Hearst and Nippigan. That's 400 kilometers. So we've met with the minister, associate minister, requesting that they look at creating a stop somewhere in Greenstone that is year-round so people have the opportunity to get out of their trucks.
McPherson says he plans to continue this discussion with the province moving forward. Vasilios Bellos, TBT News.
We'll have more on the 3-day conference later on in the show. Highway 17 between Chappaqua and Ignace was closed on Friday due to a fatal collision. OPP say 2 vehicles collided east of Upslot around 2:30 in the afternoon. One person was pronounced dead at the scene and another person was transported to hospital by EMS with serious injuries. The highway was dry and clear at the time. Well, a highway crash last Friday morning near Dryden claimed the lives of 2 children. Siblings Callie and Evan Joseph of Shoal Lake 39 were traveling to Thunder Bay with their parents, Serena and Cal Joseph, who were also transported to hospital but discharged later that day. OPP are investigating the 3-vehicle crash, which happened on Highway 17 east of Dryden. Anyone with information is asked to contact police or Crime Stoppers. Lee Noonan has more on the tragic loss.
15-year-old Callie and 11-year-old Evan were both avid minor hockey players, and there's been a massive outpouring of support and of grief from the hockey community around the region. The family of 4 was traveling to Thunder Bay for the Battle on the Bay women's hockey tournament, which took place last weekend at the Fort William First Nation Arena. The A-Division champs, the Wash-Ups, posed for a photo with Callie's team, the Shoal Lake Flyers, and her number 23 jersey. They pledged to donate their entire $2,000 tournament prize money to the Josephs. Several other teams also donated their winnings. Meanwhile, a GoFundMe campaign has been set up to raise funds in support of the family in the aftermath of their heartbreaking loss. The campaign exceeded its $35,000 goal in less than 24 hours, and donations are still coming in. A procession was held on Wednesday with hundreds holding hockey sticks and wearing jerseys to show their respects along the streets from Kenora to Iskatwazagaigan 39 Independent First Nation, where a traditional funeral was held on Thursday. Lee Noonan, TBT News.
On Wednesday, several Treaty 9 First Nations launched a historic legal case against the Ontario and federal governments regarding the use of their lands. The 10 First Nations are looking for $95 billion in compensation for breach of treaty and duties and for major changes to decision-making in Treaty 9 territory, which covers about 2/3 of Ontario. Cilio Spellos has the story.
It's a historic legal case looking to end Crown decision-making control in Treaty 9 First Nations.
Colonialism is a crime. This case is to end that crime.
Leaders from 10 First Nations in the Treaty 9 area are launching a case against the province and Ottawa, challenging what's being called the Crown's unilateral decision-making in the territory. Treaty 9 covers about 2/3 of Ontario, from the northeast to the northwest. The case argues the treaty agreed upon in the early 1900s should see these First Nations retain their decision-making governance over the lands and resources, and that Crown and Indigenous governments must consent to impactful resource development moving forward. The suit is also seeking $95 billion for breach of treaty and of duties. Lawyer Kate Kempton says the signing of the treaty itself was done in a misleading way by the Crown.
They brought that written text in their pockets to talk to the leaders of the First Nations in Treaty 9 territory. They never showed them the text. They did not leave it with them. They did not describe some of the words in the written text.
The case has massive implications if ruled in favor of the First Nations, affecting a number of areas such as mining, forestry, land sales, and hydro. That would include significant projects such as the Ring of Fire development, only able to move forward with these communities' consent.
We got a lot of documentations, written documents in our community that says that the treaty was not done right.
Edmonton First Nation Chief Solomon Etlukin believes these arguments are reasonable and that governments need to consult them on development moving forward.
Proposing solutions for shared decisions, the Crown continues to fight us and repeat the half-truth.
We look at other colonial countries that have been given back to the original people. You really got to understand where we're coming from. We're here to take back what was stolen.
Kempton says next steps for the plaintiffs include hiring expert witnesses to review the evidence, but she could not provide timelines for when the issue could be taken to court. Vasilios Bellos, TBT News.
Later that day, Kiiwetinoong MPP Saul Mamaquad challenged Northern Development and Indigenous Affairs Minister Greg Rickford at Queen's Park over development on their traditional lands. Mamaquad says Ontario needs to engage in meaningful consultation with First Nations before any new mining developments, including the Ring of Fire, can move forward.
First Nations and mining companies know that nothing is happening there until real partnerships occur. Will Ontario recognize that it has abused the treaty promises and continued efforts by the Premier to bulldoze the North will lead to conflict and stall any real partnerships?
These are major legacy infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker, and they reflect a new opportunity, an opportunity for the government to work closely with Indigenous leaders through their economic development corporations, through their political leadership, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that they have the kind of infrastructure they need, the tools that their young people need and want, Mr. Speaker, things like road access, other forms of energy. There are leaders here who represent communities that are still deriving their electricity from diesel. I can't help but think that the honourable member stands against that, Mr. Speaker. The Wate Power Connection and other legacy pieces of infrastructure, including companies owned and operated by Indigenous people, Mr. Speaker, stand ready to supply good, clean energy to those northern communities, roads to improve their health, social and economic access to programming, Mr. Speaker, and that's what this government does best, and that's what we'll continue to work on.
Another First Nation in the region is pushing back against mining. White Sand First Nation has told the Ford government that no future mining activities will occur on their homelands until more consultation with the community occurs. The First Nation near Armstrong sent a letter to 3 cabinet ministers, including Greg Rickford. Chief Alan Gustafson says proper protocols have not been followed with the encroachment of mining companies into the area around White Sand. This comes in the context of Ontario's proposed Build More Mines Act, which Gustafson says they have not been consulted on. First Nation says the halt is now in place until further notice. And with that, we'll be back after the break with more stories from days 1 and 2 of the Noma Conference. Welcome back, and like we were saying before the break, the Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association kicked off their annual conference on Wednesday at the Victoria Inn. A number of provincial party leaders addressed the municipal delegates, including the new leader of Ontario's NDP. Lee Noonan was there.
Opposition leader Merritt Stiles made her first public appearance in the region at the 2023 Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association's conference in Thunder Bay. Stiles addressed the gathering of elected officials and municipal staffers, urging them to ask hard questions of the Conservative MPPs who are slated to attend Noma on day 3.
This government has made it clear that they are not interested in hearing from you or from other municipalities in this province. They refuse to understand that their one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work for smaller towns and cities and rural communities, and that this government does not and will not understand the unique needs and challenges of Northwestern Ontario.
Stiles is positioning the NDP as the best party to represent the region at Queen's Park, promising to apply a northern lens on all NDP legislation. Stiles was not alone in making her appeal to local leaders. The provincial Liberals and Green Party also addressed the conference.
And whether it's the sale of Crown land, the cost of hosting railways and the taxes involved, road safety and maintenance and attracting talent and labor, the issues facing Northern Ontario are not dissimilar from the rest of the province, but have obviously a unique flavor.
And everyone knows that Northern Ontario is especially well positioned to be a global leader in attracting that capital investment and creating jobs and prosperity for northern communities. But in order to get there, we need a government that's going to invest in the people of the North and in new ways of doing things.
The conference theme this year is New Beginnings and Lessons Learned. According to Noma Chair Wendy Landry, a staggering 40% of municipal leaders elected last fall were first-time politicians. She urges officials of all experience levels to take advantage of the many training and information sessions that will be available throughout the 3-day conference.
Over the next few days, we have an exciting agenda to help our new and returning elected officials to learn best practices and lessons that could prove useful as you continue in your role. We hope that you feel more prepared to tackle future challenges and draw from the lessons of past leaders to support you better in your future and the future of your municipality.
Lee Noonan, TBT News.
The tensions between economic development, environmental protections, and Indigenous rights were highlighted on day 2 of the Noma Conference in Thunder Bay as questions were raised about caribou protection and a new hydroelectric dam. Once again, here's Lee Noonan.
Economic development, the environment, and relations with Indigenous peoples are reoccurring themes at Noma 2023. Ian Dunn, President and CEO of the Ontario Forestry Industry Association, raised concerns about the economic impact of a possible federal protection order on caribou habitat.
Estimated there's 32 mills in the province that depend on a wood supply from areas that fall within caribou ranges. So not all of those mills would close, but some of them would.
The concern stems from a leaked letter in which the federal environment minister said the province was failing to effectively protect caribou habitat. Although Dunn says a protection order could be devastating, he did express optimism that the federal minister was simply playing to his base.
The federal government, Canada, signed an agreement with Ontario to conserve caribou. So we're left wondering why would you be taking these steps if we haven't even had a chance to implement these conservation measures?
In response to a question about progress on the Little Jackfish hydroelectric dam, OPG Director Heather Brown said they would take the time that was needed for each of the Lake Nipigon area First Nations to have a chance to consult with their members before proceeding, at which point new environmental assessment work would need to be completed.
There's no reason why you can't rely on old data and tagging of fish, measurements that you took. So it's not back to square one, but there would still be a significant piece of it to be conducted.
According to Noma President Wendy Landry, a session on relationship building with First Nations was one of the most popular with attendees.
Don't even worry about consultation. Start making some friends. And consultation won't be such a formality if people have relationships and they can go and talk to their neighbors about something that's come up And then you could get into the formalities depending on the project.
On day one, NDP leader Merritt Stiles made a point of highlighting the work some municipalities in the region are already doing to partner with neighboring First Nations.
Talking about places like Marathon and Pick River. That's how you do it. Not railroading over relationships and treaty rights. That's a road to conflict. That's a road to nowhere. And we've got things to get done.
Lee Noonan, TBT News.
The organization that manages the province's power system says the Northwest will need an increase in electrical capacity as soon as possible. We'll have that story after the break. Welcome back. The independent electricity system operator is recommending that Hydro One construct phase 2 of the Waasigan transmission line, extending from Atikokan to Dryden. The IESO says the Northwest needs the additional electrical capacity as soon as possible. Carl Langdon reports.
The IESO's recommendation that the construction of the Waasigan transmission lines phase 2 begin by 2025 is the green light that Hydro One has been waiting for. The recommendation follows the IESO's forecasted future demand for electricity in Northern Ontario, largely driven by projected demands from the mining sector.
With respect to phase 2, today's announcement is fantastic news because it gives us the green light and the clarity on the expectations of when phase 2 is to be brought into service.
What we're forecasting is that demand for electricity in the west of Thunder Bay region will be increasing due to development of new mines, expansion of existing mines, and electrification of mining activity. So this is the reason we've recommended the Waasigan transmission line to supply that growing demand for electricity.
According to Karen Akaran, the utility plans to commence the construction of Phase 2 between Atikokan and Dryden as soon as possible after Phase 1 between Shunia and Atikokan is energized sometime in 2025. When asked whether the opposition by the neighbors on the line group in Kaministiquia has or will impact the scheduled construction of Phase 1, Karen Akaran and Ahmed both say Hydro One's timeframes should remain the same.
There are things that occur on projects which we'll continually sort of monitor and update on forecasts, but the plans right now are to bring the project in within the requested timeframe.
I don't believe it will impact the in-service date, but that's more of a question for Hydro One, since they're the ones ultimately responsible for implementing this recommendation and developing and constructing the line.
Karen Akaran says the public should expect the release of a drafted version of the line's environmental assessment report sometime in the coming weeks. Hydro One's prior decision to stick with their preliminary preferred route was largely justified by referring to figures contained in the unreleased report.
We're on track for releasing a draft environmental assessment in the coming weeks. That'll be out for a public review and comment period. We're planning on filing for a leave to construct in the middle of this year, all pointing towards activities commencing with construction in 2024 to enable that in-servicing of the asset as close to the end of 2025 as possible.
Following the release of the report, Hydro One is planning for a question and review period, where community members will be given an opportunity to voice their concerns. Carl Langdon, TBT News.
A sentence was handed down this week in the homicide case against Jonathan Yellowhead, more than 4 years after the body of 17-year-old Braden Jacob was found at Chapels Park in Thunder Bay. 27-year-old Jonathan Yellowhead was found guilty of manslaughter in August following a 2-week trial. Jacob was from Webequie First Nation and was here in the city for grief counseling. The court heard Jacob and Yellowhead had left an Arthur Street hotel together in December of 2018 and were seen walking towards the Limbrick Street area. Jacob was reported missing the next day, and his body was discovered 3 days later. Jacob's DNA was found in bloodstains on Yellowhead's backpack and on the doorframe of a Limbrick residence. The Crown was seeking 8 to 12 years in prison for Yellowhead, while the defense was asking for 3 to 5 years. The judge decided on a sentence of 5 years and 4 months. With credit for time served, Yellowhead will spend another 22 months behind bars. It's been nearly 7 years since the 7 youth inquest recommendations were released. The year-long inquest looked into the tragic deaths of 7 students who were attending high school in Thunder Bay after leaving their families and home communities to pursue their education. The Anishinaabe Nation has released several reports in the years following the inquest. This week, they hosted a 2-day conference to elevate the progress and safe accommodations for Indigenous youth attending schools in the city. Mike Lang reports.
These are such needless, senseless deaths with the students that were full of hope and promise and moving ahead. So, like in many areas, the system failed them.
Ensuring that the system does not fail future Indigenous students in Thunder Bay was the goal of NAN's Continuity of Care Forum. While most of the recommendations from the 2016 inquest have been implemented, the forum was an opportunity to discuss what has worked and what has not.
There are some areas that are working in terms of improved mental health, improved coordination of services among agencies as well.
On the other hand, event MC Sandy Boucher says more needs to be done in terms of making Indigenous students feel at home away from home instead of assimilating them to Thunder Bay.
I think it's really super important for people working with the students or anyone from the northern communities to realize they are grieving.
I would say that all students are grieving because if they're here in a different place than home, they're grieving for home. To help with the grief is to make sure that we stay connected. It doesn't have to be on a professional level, but just to make sure that we are connected with one another.
As a result, NAN Deputy Chief Bobby Narcisse also applauded the efforts of local services that have helped students feel an increased sense of togetherness outside of school.
There has been some supports from many of our partners, like Matawa and KO and Wendigo Tribal Councils, just to name a few, that have really actively stepped up to really create a community-based solution.
The Continuity of Care Forum continues on Thursday as speakers and attendees will further discuss how to create a safer education environment for First Nation students in Thunder Bay. Mike Lang, TBT News.
And that wraps up this edition of Northwest News Week. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you right back here next week.